Really honored to, really be part of this movement because for the first time, we are trying to study Christian flourishing from a social scientific point of view. Most of the work on Christian flourishing, if most of you are familiar with the work in this space, are usually very theological or philosophical in nature. And this is the first time we're trying to take a social scientific approach to address the topic. But let me start with a little bit of a story. Aside from my work at Regen as an associate professor of psychology in a Doctor of Clinical Psychology program at Regen, I'm also a faculty affiliate at the Human Flourishing program at Harvard, where we try to study human flourishing globally. But essentially, we have two goals, and the first goal is to advance cross-disciplinary research on human flourishing. But also the second goal is to synthesize and share knowledge across different disciplines. Now, this is very important because part of the synthesis of knowledge involves finding ways to actually work with different people, right? And the Human Flourishing Program is placed within a social science and quantitative research institute, but most of the people on the team are epidemiologists, but also we have psychologists, we have theologians. But to do this requires us thinking beyond just a particular discipline, right? And looking at what human flourishing might mean in different cross disciplines. Now, my friend Tyler Vandervelde, one of his definition of human flourishing, it's a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. Now, he's recently kind of modified this definition because we kind of tend to think that this is more of a well-being thing because well-being is very subjective. It's about the individual. But with human flourishing, there's an extension to that where we talk about that it's a state in which all aspects of life is good in relation to one's environment, right? So if your environment is not flourishing and you tend to think you're doing okay, maybe it's well-being and not necessarily human flourishing. But that distinction, I think it's important. But one of the things that have also been done with the work of Tyler Vandervelde has been to look at the different pillars or pathways of flourishing: family, work, education, religious community. Now, and also the outcomes and the ends that most people seek to get to. The two things about this, these dimensions, is that one is that they're universally desired, but also they're an end in themselves, right? But this consensus, they're useful, right? They help us, items, they help us to kind of, or this criteria rather, helps us to kind of get a sense of what's important, right? Regardless of the culture. Now, religious community is a big part of the pathways, right, of human flourishing. But and so most of the research on human flourishing in itself has touched on things like religion and health. Most people study virtues and character strengths. There's also research on religious communities. There's also now the global flourishing study. I'm sure most of you might have heard about that as well. There's been beautiful collaborations in the process of doing all this work with our colleagues at Harvard and even at Baylor and even beyond. But even though this is the case, we've not asked the question, given the fact that human flourishing is a state in which all aspects of a person's life is good in relation to their context. We've not asked the question of how, in the Christian context, for example, how would Christian communities engage? How do they even engage the topic of flourishing? Of course, given the fact that we're talking about the largest population in the world, almost of 2 billion people worldwide. And so this question has led us to ask further questions around what does flourishing even look like in the context of Christian community, and how have other people pursued these questions, and how can our work kind of complement existing work. And this is the questions that we started asking as we started to collaborate and invite, my friend would call it speed dating, where we, have people on a Zoom call just to get a sense of what they are doing. And that was around the time that I had the opportunity to meet some of the wonderful people that you'll be hearing from today. And also that led to an important initiative that we launched last year, Flourishing on the Church, with a team of colleagues, Tyler Vanderville, Byron Johnson, Kate Long, and that guy there, I can't remember his name, and also my friend Matthew Lee, who we all came together. It was a collaborative project between Harvard University, Baylor, and also Regent. And last year we had a Christian Flourishing Summer School, and it was part of Action Question: how are different groups and different people studying Christian flourishing, right? And it was we had a wonderful time, and thanks to my team who really helped to make this all happen. Wouldn't have done it without them. Now, so when we talk about Christian flourishing, because it's important that we lay down this context, this is how I met Liz, I met Chris, I met Leslie, and interacted with them around the work that they are doing. And we try to talk about Christian flourishing, taking a domain-based approach. And what that means is recognizing that Christian flourishing is not just one thing, right? It's multidimensional. It's about the flourishing Christian, but also it's about the flourishing congregation, but also it's about that congregation being spread out to also impact their communities. And that question led us to look at these three domains. And one of the things that I found was that as psychologists, we are very interested in the individual domain, right? We are interested in the individual because that's a quest of psychology, to see what's happening with the individual. We're not necessarily interested in the social processes, although most of our colleagues that are social psychologists are interested in those patterns. And so we had some of our colleagues like Leslie that also had that background in social psychology to ask that question around what's happening at the congregational level, but also at the community level as well. What about the common good, the public witness? What does that mean? How does that really translate to the community? And so the presentations that you'll be hearing this morning, or this evening, or this afternoon rather, would all be about this. So each of us will anchor or address these topics from a particular domain. As a psychologist myself, I'm interested in the individual Christian, right? Same with my colleague Liz, who is also a clinical psychologist, and will be asking about what does flourishing mean for the individual Christian. And we both developed an overlapping framework to help understand that, and also a measure as well. That all came out in this special issue. I'm happy to pass that around later. And my colleague Leslie Francis will, I've been trying to find you, okay, would talk about his over 2 decades of work that he's done on congregational science, just to synthesize some of the work he's done and help us understand what flourishing means at the congregational level. Now, of course, we also have the community domain itself. Unfortunately, our colleague that was supposed to do that presentation was not able to. He had to travel back due to a family emergency. But we'll hear these two domains and hear how we are approaching this topic. Again, just the special issue for anyone that wants to look that up. And so now I have about 5 minutes left, or 3 minutes rather, to kind of summarize what I've done. Why is Christian flourishing important? Well, we know that flourishing is multidimensional in Christian life and practice. So it's important that we think about how the integration of psychology and theology can help us to not only study this, but also to support this. Now, there are two ways that we could study Christian flourishing at the individual level. One is to engage it theologically, which that theological engagement leans towards sort of an emic, approach, or emic engagement of what spiritual well-being might be. But also the other is also to engage it theoretically. Now, what I mean by that is to think about what does flourishing mean from, let's say, from a psychological lens, and we zoom in to the Christian life. Or theologically, what does flourishing mean theologically, right, as we zoom in within the Christian life? And I think these are two social scientific or scientific approach that we could use. And what we've done in our work, for example, is to think about what this might look like. Like, for example, most people that have studied flourishing in itself, like Aristotle, Seligman and Vanderbilt, or you could see the traits and how they've all talked about flourishing and the different dimensions. And they're all saying the same thing. Pleasure, it's about positive emotion or about happiness and life satisfaction. The same thing with activity, engagement. And you see the pattern, right? But the thing with this is that it applies that ends in themselves, and you could understand how this kind of, unfolds within particular cultures. And taking the emic approach, and I think Tyler has done well in doing this, you could study it from an emic lens and use this frameworks or patterns or dimensions and use that as a way to look into whether or not, let's say, Christian, for example, is flourishing. And for example, with the Global Flourishing Study data, we looked at that in 19 countries. And interestingly, you can compare what that looks like, right? Using general principles or ethic frameworks or measures of flourishing, and that's what we did, but one thing we realize is that the problem here is that most of the current measures of individual flourishing, they often overlook the important role of Christian values and the capabilities of the Christian life in defining what constitutes a good Christian life. I'm looking at my time. Now, but what we've done, given this problem, is to engage the topic from an emic framework, an emic perspective. Given the fact that general models, we know they're valuable, they're important, but they're not often sufficient, right, to understand the Christian life or to understand what it means to flourish as a Christian. Now, we could also apply the same lens in any religious tradition, again, Now, one of the framing that we used, or the framework, was the abundant life. Most of us that are familiar with the text in John 10:10, but the abundant life is sort of a theological anchor, right, for a life to live life to the full, right, where we see flourishing coexisting with suffering. There's something about suffering and Christian flourishing that they kind of overlap or coexist. But also we see within this framework, we see church life as a way of cultivating the theological virtues that Aristotle wrote about, faith, hope, and love. Now, what we did was to kind of look at this, but important thing to mention, it's also the fact that within this framework, we see Christ at the center because within the Christian theology, true and lasting flourishing for Christians begins with a relationship with Christ, right? Now, that's not theologically debated. Anyone that identifies as a Christian, that's sort of the starting point, right? However, why that is the case, we know that relationship with Christ then leads or fuels or produces, some will call it the fruit of the Spirit. Aquinas would say it's theological virtues. It produces faith, hope, and love. Now, my colleague Liz Hall, for example, would argue that love animates these other virtues that, love helps, which is true ultimately, because when you think about it, when you have love, it will lead you to become faithful, follower, believer, you'll be more faithful and maybe, to some degree, hopeful in that process. And so this virtues becomes gifts from God when we're in that relationship, and then it empowers believers to live a flourishing life. However, when we do that, we're grounded in this relationship, which then bears this fruit and the theological virtues. There's a reorientation to Christian ends and motives. And this took us about 2 years. We were deliberating on what this might look like. And, we came settled on this, contentment, meaning, character, stewardship, relationships, health. I can't go in depth because of my time, so I have like 2 minutes to wrap up. But essentially, Christian reframing for individual flourishing becomes very important. It's the same broad areas that we covered earlier. It's different, but essentially, the language is different, but it's the same thing. And so this is the framework that we work. Essentially, faith in itself grounds each dimension in God's reality. Hope in itself sustains confidence in what lies ahead. love expresses and perfects every dimension. And we see this could play on in each of the domain that we kind of talk about. And that's the measure that we, our Christian Flourishing Index. And now, let's bring it back now. And what we've done is to extend this conversation. And if you look at that history, you could see this fun guys all smiling, and somehow you could see how that overlaps with what has been done. Now, contentment, we think it's much more a better language for Christians, given the fact that, well, happiness and life satisfaction is not necessarily the goal, right? But we know if you're content with what God has given you, if you know that you have contentment, you have peace and joy, which then leads to happiness and life satisfaction. Now, financial stability is not necessarily the goal in the Christian life, but we know if we're good stewards with what God has given us, that we'll ultimately have financial well-being. Now, how do we apply this? Two things we could do. We could take a supplemental approach, or we could take a replacement approach. What I mean by that is we could use the general flourishing measure that we have that's been developed, or measures of well-being, or that of the flourishing index that my colleague Tyler Vanderville has, and compare that with what we have. Or we could completely replace it and focus on the Christian Flourishing Index so that we can capture the Christian-specific insights into what a flourishing life would be. I'll stop here and introduce my colleague Liz Hall, who also would talk about the individual domain, but essentially would argue and engage that from a different point of view. Thank you.
I remember about 20 years ago when the concept of flourishing became popular in academic circles. It seemed like all of a sudden everybody was talking about flourishing. And of course, this wasn't just happening in psychology, but it seemed like across a variety of different fields in economy and sociology and theology and even philosophy, where there had been a long history of talking about flourishing, that there was just a renewed interest in trying to explore this concept of human flourishing. Now, what's very interesting is that with now 20 short years of investigating this question in the short term, and of course many, many more years before that if we consider the long philosophical history of exploring the question of human flourishing, you might think that we would have some kind of definitive answers regarding what human flourishing is. But it turns out that is not the case, that in spite of the central place occupied by flourishing in a lot of contemporary thought, there really is no consensus regarding what this term means. Even within the field of psychology, there is no consensus. This is because the word flourishing is not an objective term. It is a term that reflects underlying assumptions about the world, including fundamentally the notion of what the good life is, what the good life is all about. And of course, this is a question that is answered in some distinctive ways by each worldview, including each religious tradition. And so the project that I'll be describing is an attempt to try to answer this question of what is flourishing from within one particular religious tradition, that of Christianity. And so the work that I'm going to be describing for you comes out of some work from an interdisciplinary team that I've been leading for the past 10 years or so. On this team, we have 3 psychologists, 2 theologians, a counselor, and a philosopher. And in fact, the theological work I'll be drawing on today comes from our theologian, Kelly Kapic, and Crystal Park, who couldn't be here today, is the psychologist who led the empirical work that I'm going to be describing. And I, of course, want to mention that this work was funded as part of a grant that we had from the John Templeton Foundation. Now, from a Christian perspective, there are 2 primary problems with the views of flourishing that are commonly used in our field to describe this concept. The first is the grounding in the self versus in divine revelation. So, of course, a secular perspective doesn't take into account a transcendent source outside of the self that informs the question of what the good life is, that provides some kind of norm for this, that informs our vision of the good life. And so the default then is that this concept of what the good life is often focused then on the self. Some of the concepts that you see in psychology are that it reflects a developing sense of autonomy, of self-reliance, and usually some kind of accumulation of psychological resources and psychological skills. And by definition, because these are centered on the person, they are subjective. They can be very unique to each person. So to put this problem in a different way, from the opposite perspective, a Christian worldview assumption is going to bring to the table all kinds of assumptions about reality that come from biblical accounts, things like the existence of God, the spiritual nature of what it means to be human, the existence of sin and of redemption, certain expectations about the future, about the way that history is going to unfold. This is talked about theologically in terms of eschatology, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of these are going to inform that very important notion of the good life that is the foundation for trying to understand what flourishing is. A second related problem has to do with the absence of a defined purpose of life in secular accounts. Usually the concept of purpose or meaning is baked into accounts of flourishing, but again, it's very subjective. The content of that is something that is left up to each individual person. But each religious tradition brings with it some notion of the purpose of human life. And so, for example, we might consider that in Christianity, the concept of fullness or completeness is, as theologian Tom Wright says, a character formed by overflowing generous love. And so in this concept, there's this notion of divine love that is received and participated in and that flows out then from the person. So Kelly Kapic developed this conceptualization of flourishing, and he defines it as saying that we have flourishing when the person experiences flourishing as their relation to God, neighbor, self, and creation exemplify love. Divine love received, participated in, and then extended to others. This is based on what is often known as the greatest commandment. Some people call it the two greatest commandments. Some people consider it one, a two-part commandment, but the love of God and love of neighbor as it's found in the Gospel of Matthew. And there's a long theological tradition here in Christianity as well. So for example, Augustine argued that this divine love reorients self-love, and it also repositions our relationship with the earth as a whole. According to theologian Miroslav Volf's interpretation of Augustinian accounts, the supreme good which makes human beings truly happy, we might say flourishing, consists in love of God and neighbor and the enjoyment of both. Augustine wrote in The City of God that the flourishing life, or what we might call the flourishing life, is one that is the perfectly ordered and harmonious enjoyment of God and each other in God. So let me point out again that this is fundamentally different from contemporary, primarily self-enrichment models of flourishing, because self-enrichment is not central to a love-based flourishing. Certainly there might be some self-enriching that occurs along the way. Vic talked a lot about virtues. Certainly the cultivation of virtues would be part of it. The cultivation of skills in terms of developing skills that might be used in love for others. So for example, as an academic, I might say that my academic work, it manifests in perhaps a way of loving you all as I try to work for the good of the psychological community. But it's not fundamentally about that. And in fact, one of the things that a Christian conception of flourishing has to encompass is the idea that there can be self-sacrifice, which is actually kind of the opposite of self-enrichment, that it encompasses that. So Jesus, for example, says, whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So that's one way in which it's going to differ from secular versions of flourishing, is that encompassing this kind of self-sacrifice. Another way in which it does this is by transcending death as the end of life. Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor notes that the Christian story of our potential transformation by love requires that we see our life as going beyond the bounds of its quote unquote natural scope between birth and death, that our lives extend beyond, again, quote unquote, this life. So we took some of this theological work that I've just tried to summarize very, very briefly here, and what we did is we developed a 3x4 matrix framework by combining these 4 contexts of love of God, of neighbor, of self, and of creation, with Aristotle's components of virtuous dispositional activity. So Aristotle talked about doing the right thing, which refers to behaviors, for the right reason. We might say that this is the cognitive or the worldview component, while experiencing the right emotion. And here's the affective component of it. And so if you combine these, you have these 12 distinct aspects of Christian flourishing that we set about trying to assess. And so let me walk you briefly through our measure development process. This involved 3 studies. In study 1, what we did is we generated a bunch of items, 84 different items, trying to capture these 12 dimensions. And then we gave these items to 5 experts who had terminal degrees in philosophy or theology, and they evaluated them for things like face validity and construct fidelity and clarity of wording. And at the end of that process, we were left with 81 items. And what we did is we then went on to cognitive interviewing. We recruited 10 people, 2 participants from each of 5 different Christian traditions. And we had some decent diversity there in terms of gender and ethnicity. And then we went through a process with each one of about 1.5 hours where we asked them to do some think aloud in terms of processing what they were reading, and then some verbal probe procedures. 2 researchers then looked over the responses here to see whether there were any difficulties in comprehension or recall or judgment, or even their ability to articulate responses to these. They also looked to see if there were meaningful differences between the different Christian traditions, since we wanted something that would be broadly Christian and not just specific to one Christian tradition. Study 2 then involved our exploratory factor analysis with an online sample. You can see some of the details there. And what we ended up with was, based on factor loadings, a strong 1-factor solution and a somewhat weaker 3-factor solution. And what we did is we iteratively worked through that EFA to try to come up with the 20 best items to represent our construct. From there, we moved on to study 3, and this was our validation study, again with an online sample. We did confirmatory analysis. We also had some preliminary evidence of reliability and validity. We ended up, as you can see, with a strong internal consistency, alpha 0.95, and also over a 2-week period, we had some good retest reliability. In terms of the construct validity, here is what we found. I just have the items themselves up there, so you can take a quick look at those. So in terms of our findings, what we found is that our new measure is most closely related to intimacy with God. That's what this item is. A very strong correlation, which makes sense. Our measure is based on experiencing God's love and then expressing it in certain ways, and so it makes sense that intimacy with God would be the most highly correlated. We also had a measure of spiritual well-being, and as you can see, the correlations were all quite high with the subscales of that particular measure. We had some general psych of religion measures that are included in just about every psych of religion study, and as you can see, pretty decent correlations with intrinsic religiosity and religious participation, relatively weaker, though still significant, with extrinsic religiosity. And then we had some more traditional measures of well-being. This addresses what we might call hedonic well-being, so just kind of the feeling of things. And as you can see, we had good correlations with actually all three measures in the expected directions. Now here's where things get interesting. We had included a secular flourishing scale in our data set. This is Ed Diener's 2010 flourishing measure. It's an 8-item measure that measures different aspects of social psychological prosperity, things like relationships and optimism and purpose. And as you can see in all of the correlations here, this was actually one of the weakest ones. So what does this mean? Well, take a look at the scale here. One of the critiques of the general concept of flourishing that I made earlier is that they're all quite subjective and self-referential. And if you look at these items, all but one basically have to do with that kind of way of conceptualizing flourishing. And so I think what this correlation emphasizes is the point that Christian flourishing, as we are conceptualizing here, is quite distinct from some of the secular conceptualizations that are used in psychological research. And then, of course, we had some just other well-being measures, depression, anxiety, and PTSD symptoms, and these correlated in the expected directions here. All right, so what does this all mean for research, perhaps even for practice? Well, one thing I want to just kind of mention here is that there's a big push in the clinical arena to try to become more and more clinically sensitive to the people that we are working with. And this might be one way. I mean, this has not yet been used in clinical settings, so we'd have to see how to make this usable in kind of a clinically relevant way, but it does seem like it would be a way of measuring well-being from the perspective of the client, taking into account the things that the client, him or herself, feel is most relevant. For researchers, this newly developed scale represents a different way of pushing forward this field of flourishing, a recognition that flourishing does have a grounding in the different worldviews that we are trying to operationalize, that Christian flourishing might lead to certain subsequent behaviors and decision-making, mental and physical health in ways that are different from those that are measured in more kind of generically secular ways. And of course, the hope would be that different traditions, different religious traditions, would take on the work of trying to figure out what's most important from their particular religious worldview in ways that would influence conceptualizations of the good life, and perhaps come up with some kind of array of measures that could be used that would target the particular groups that we're interested in exploring. So again, just to conclude here, I just want to note that this is a part of, I think, an important push within the psychology of religion. Vic referred to the EMIC study of the psychology of religion, where we are trying to not just look at things that generalize across different religious traditions, but take into account that all religions are not equal, that they see the world in different ways, and that we, to be really faithful to those traditions and representing them, we need to get at what's most important to the people that we are studying. Thank you.
Thank you. I appear to be kitted out. Brilliant. So first of all, just a bit of positionality, so you get an idea of where I'm talking from. I think I'm a theologian. I'm an Anglican priest. As an academic, I've worked in practical theology, empirical theology, and in the scientific social study of religion, with a particular interest in biblical hermeneutics. I'm an Anglican, and in that point of view, I stand in a tradition that claims to be both rooted in a Catholic world and in a Reformed world. And that's what makes me so interested in this question of Christian flourishing within a congregational perspective. What's different about the Reformed world and the Catholic world is where the emphasis is on the salvation Is it individual relationships, or is it relationships within the community of faith? Congregational flourishing is, for me, as an Anglican Catholic, at the heart of where I want to locate Christian flourishing. The second bit of my positionality is that I think I'm a psychologist, a research psychologist shaped in the individual differences tradition. And for that reason, you're likely to hear an emphasis on personality, an emphasis on measurement, on collectivity. So there's the positionality. My extreme appreciation for the invitation to be part of this group and an opportunity to see if my own research fits in some way with this broad question of trying to define what flourishing is. I'm going to do two things in this presentation. First, briefly to summarize what the paper's about, in case you ever feel you don't need to read it. And secondly, to take a segue into a psychological perspective within that broader presentation. So the paper profiles the contribution to the science of the congregational domain of Christian flourishing made by a research group working in England and Wales, geographically located, and shaped by the perspective of empirical theology. In this context, the congregational domain is defined as the local physical presence of the body of Christ, concerned with the twin aims of nurturing disciples and serving local communities. In this presentation, attention is given to three strands of research undertaken by this research group. Listening to church leavers, why people exit the congregational domain. Listening to church goers, why people remain in the congregational domain. And researching the wider ministry and mission of cathedrals. Each of those three strands combines quantitative and qualitative approaches and draws on the three disciplines of theology, psychology, and, dare I confess it, sociology. My main interest in theology and psychology is in a dialogue between the two. I sense that theology has things to teach psychology. Why do I sense that? Because psychology and theology are about the same material in my worldview understanding. It's about what it is to be human. But those two disciplines carry very different narratives, background narratives, about what it means to be human. I also believe that the theologian can learn a lot from the psychologist about disentangling aspects of what it is to be human. So those three strands of research that I tried to bring together, just briefly introducing them. Church Leavers, the second of two books I did with a colleague, Philip Richter. The first was called Gone But Not Forgotten. The second is a little less optimistic. We framed our research originally by interviewing, trying to listen to what church leavers were saying. We then designed a survey, and the problem about researching church leavers is they don't turn up in a place on a Sunday morning to fill in questionnaires. We tried to access them by live phone calls, identifying people who identified themselves as church leavers, who were then foolish enough to say they would take a survey, and 56% of them did. Now, what were the core findings from that? People who disengage from the congregation do so for a variety of reasons. We identified 15, but the one that really appealed to me and seemed to make a lot of sense was the not fitting in and getting out. I didn't fit into my congregation, I exited it. And I see core implications from that require work. One is within the tradition of individual differences, and I've tried to develop an theological underpinning for that. And the other is in the nature of congregations themselves and the interaction between congregations. I've developed an ecclesiology of multiplex church on the basis of listening to church leavers. The second strand, the science of congregation studies, shows one particular project sponsored by an Anglican diocese, a diocese that has got 3 episcopal areas and was therefore conducted in 3 different stages, that had the complete support of the diocese behind us. The surprise is 97% of churches participated, and we acquired a data set of 32,000 people. We were able to do a lot with that quantity of information. The core findings again, church congregations, there are people who are missing. They're the opposite of the people who are dominating. There are people who are missing. They're the opposite of the people who are dominating. Once again, I was faced with those 2 core implications. A theology of individual difference. Does God love all, the young as well as the old, the male as well as the female? What about the people who are not accessing these congregations? And again, focusing on the ecclesiology of the multiplex church that may be in a capacity of building communities in different ways, but which are interconnected. I move on to the Science of Cathedral Studies, a 2015 book, in which I'm beginning to see, through a tapestry of interrelated projects, some qualitative, some quantitative, that cathedrals may be reaching people that churches are not reaching. And the core implication of that for me is that cathedrals may be able to embrace individual difference in a better way than local churches, and can in fact exemplify a multiplex ecclesiology. Cathedrals can be a laboratory for the science of congregational flourishing. And one of the ways I'm trying to implement that now is through managing a knowledge transfer partnership between one cathedral, the cathedral in which I serve as a canon theologian, Liverpool, and the small Anglican university in which I now operate, Bishop Grosseteste University. The knowledge transfer project is put into the cathedral for a 3-year period of full-time academic. An academic whose job is to work with the cathedral management and staff. This is a big cathedral. There are 70 full-time staff within it, as well as several hundred volunteers. It runs a big business in the tourist industry, in the hospitality industry, and in the hosting of art and exhibition, as well as in its liturgical world. We're interested in that cathedral becoming better informed about the impact it has on its community and becoming itself research engaged and research active within the science of congregation and cathedral studies. To segue into a psychological stream within this work, exploring individual differences is important to me to understand the not fitting in and the getting out. To understand the sex differences, why men feel so uncomfortable in a community composed largely of women, why the young are feeling uncomfortable in a community largely comprised of the old. The same, I think, can extend for ethnicity, and I want to suggest that it can also extend to personality. The theology of individual differences with which I work is rooted in Genesis 1:27. God creates humankind in the image of God. In the image of God, God creates them. Male and female, God creates them. There seems to be a core theology of a God who creates individual difference. And if it works for the sex differences, then it works, I think, also for the ethnic differences. And it works also for psychological differences. But it's there that theology and psychology have to talk to each other, because what do I mean by personality differences? In thinking of the science of what it is to be human in terms of theology, we need both to draw on a doctrine of creation, God creates in the image of God creates, but also the doctrine of fall. And I think those two doctrines put side by side can help us to distinguish and sharpen the connection between personality and character, personality and pathology. Things, personality and character, that the big five, I believe, confuses. Personality and pathology, things the Isinkian model confuses. And it's for that reason I've gone out on a limb and taken a particular interest in building a theology of individual differences that draws on psychological type theory. A theory that will distinguish energy sources, conceptual perceiving sources, conceptual evaluation sources, and the environment in which people operate. For me, that model is non-judgmental. It is non-evaluative. I, as an introvert, am not the failed extrovert I thought I was when I was being trained by an extrovert priest as a curate. I, as an intuitive, have to recognize I'm not a failed sensing person, as I felt when I was trained by a sensing incumbent. As a thinking person, quite rare in the Christian community, I have to recognize I'm not a failed feeling person, as I felt when I was being trained by a feeling incumbent. The problem with psychological type theory has been largely the criticism of the way in which it's been measured, the Myers-Briggs type indicator. It's for that reason I've invested heavily in developing the Francis psychological type and emotional temperament scales, and adding to psychological type theory the dimension of emotionality, which I see also to be part of the givenness of character, of personality, that needs also to be measured. A little work at a product placement in working through the implications of that theory, both for religion and for religious leadership. Now, the thing I learned from a very early survey of church congregations is that compared with the population norms, there are more introverts, there are more sensing types, only slightly, more feeling types, and more judging types. So does that have an impact on those who prefer to be different? A second study, a congregational satisfaction study, included alongside the Francis psychological type scales a measure of congregational satisfaction. We found the profile of those congregations almost identical with the earlier study, and then taking the 16 type categories that comes from this typology, we ranked in order from the most satisfied to the least satisfied. And the least satisfied turned out to be ENTP, the very mirror image of the dominant profile of the congregation itself. Is that purely serendipity, or is it true that those who don't fit in get out, and the precursor of getting out is dissatisfaction? Moving on to congregational surveys, a study in Southwark Cathedral indicated to me that this cathedral was having a significantly different profile from those that we measured in parish churches. There were more intuitive types, there were fewer feeling types. The NTs, the categories that felt most uncomfortable within their church congregations and were getting out. My model of multiplex church advocates, rather than leaving the Christian community, move from one presentation to another, a presentation in which you may actually fit in and be resourced. Cathedral events like carol services have an even more powerful reach of bringing in those who are not normally there. Research by my colleague Bishop David Walker finds carol services actually having more men present and more women present who prefer thinking. My case needs to stop. Thank you for whatever attention you've managed to give to it.
For the opportunity. I am a third generation clergy person, so my father and grandfather were pastors, and my faith identity and identity as a clergy person really is more important to me and more central to who I am than my identity as a psychologist. However, the path that sort of unfolded for me is to spend time researching and working clinically with faith leaders and trying to figure out what is right with the healthy leaders, what are the factors, conditions, and practices that not only prevent the things that we know are prevalent for clergy in terms of emotional difficulties, health issues, et cetera, relational challenges, but what promotes flourishing over the long haul and a sustainable rhythm of those practices. And so I'm going to skip a couple of slides here. I just included this one just to orient you with how we approach this study. And I should mention this study that I'm going to share with you has been going on for almost 15 years now. It originated at the University of Notre Dame with a scholar named Dr. Matt Bloom, to whom I am deeply indebted for his friendship and for his work. He retired from academia, and so I have inherited this study from Dr. Bloom and a whole team of folks that have done amazing work. I've been involved with this study almost since the beginning, and so I want to share with you what we're learning. But we approached this looking at human flourishing, what's sort of the state of the art globally. The reason I put this slide up is so often, particularly in evangelical Christian Protestant circles in the United States, there's a lot of flourishing language kind of around. And so I'll hear flourishing and resilience and thriving all used interchangeably as if those mean the same thing. And the way that we think about this is that human flourishing is the umbrella concept, and then those are other concepts within that. I'm going to skip ahead here. So this is an example from the outset of what's called translational research. If you're not familiar with that term, it comes out of the medical research community. And the idea is that the research is actually meant to reach the people that you're researching. And so you begin with the end in mind, and in some ways you design research differently when that is the case. And so this kind of research is meant to start theoretically and then move to clinical trials, which then lead to best practices, kinds of ideas. So in fact, we are doing this. So the model I'm going to share with you, we have translated into a flourishing in ministry coaching curriculum and coaching experience, group and individual coaching for Christian clergy. We're about to begin a randomized controlled trial for that this fall with a Templeton grant. So stay tuned for that. And the hope will be we'll be able to demonstrate that we are hopefully enhancing the well-being and flourishing of clergy over time through this experience that's based on this research. It was mixed method longitudinal research, so we did somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 qualitative semi-structured interviews with a broad range of clergy in the United States, so I should mention that, Catholic, Protestant, and within Protestantism, mainline evangelical clergy. The demographic diversity essentially mirrors that of the United States population, so it was fairly diverse in terms of race and ethnicity and gender and so forth. Over time, we put those qualitative interviews in kind of an iterative process with leading measures of different dimensions of human flourishing. The distinctive of this project, though, I should emphasize, is that we were studying human flourishing, well-being at work. So as opposed to sort of general human flourishing, what is that like at work? And in particular, for people in helping professions. So people who are sort of immersed in the human condition every day and the suffering of other people in one way or another, in this case, clergy. How are people doing that kind of work and still yet experiencing the abundant life in some form? And so we chose measures that had been, I think our criteria was they'd been published in at least 50 top-tier peer-reviewed journal articles, so we knew they were well-established measures. In some cases, there wasn't a measure, an item to measure the thing we were trying to get at, so we created some of those as well. But over time, refined that survey. These are the kinds of things we asked in the narrative interviews. I won't belabor this too long. And then large-scale surveys that were looking at these kinds of domains. And again, I'll summarize for you our model here in just a minute. And we also did some daily life studies using, some of you may be familiar with randomized momentary assessment. This is where through technology you're able to ping people with one or two questions about their well-being in that moment. So they're not answering retrospectively, they're answering kind of right in that moment. One of the things we were setting out to do in that research was to try to map out the typical rhythm of your average North American clergy person over the course of, say, a week. What are the ebbs and flows to well-being? And the big research finding there was there is no typical rhythm for your typical clergy person. It's an inherently unpredictable ebb and flow. And anybody that's been in ministry leadership would tell you that. We didn't need research to tell us that, but that is one of the things we found. So then the implication of that is, well, what does that mean then for how do we predict the unpredictable, as it were? If it's an inherently unpredictable job, what are the implications of that for well-being? So there are many things we could point to when we look at being a clergy person as a professional role, and it's more than that. What most clergy people will tell you is it's not just a job, it's a calling, it's a life, it's who I am. But if we look at it as a job, there's some unique things that jumped out to us. The first is that ministry is high-stakes work, dealing with ultimate concerns. Some of you may be familiar with sanctification theory, which is not referring to the theological idea of sanctification, but more attributing spiritual significance to our work. And when that's the case, and of course that's the case for religious leaders, then we tend to be all in with our work. It's not sort of a half-hearted commitment. It's an all life, all energy, all in kind of a thing. And there are many wonderful, beautiful things about that that can also lead to overfunctioning and overworking, those kinds of things. Ministry work is very complex. In fact, it perhaps is the most complex job description of any job that exists. If you look at all the different domains of expertise that it would be nice to be an expert in, and what we call the switching costs, switching rapidly between those in any given day. It's inherently complex, continuous, it's never done, and diverse. And as a result, clergy experience what we call role immersion, meaning they're immersed in the role 24/7. And a lot of that has to do with the way people relate to that role as well. So most any religious leader you talk to will tell you, yeah, I met somebody on an airplane or in an airport or something, and we got chatting, and then they asked, what do I do? And I told them, and they immediately changed how they relate to me. They're immediately on their best behavior, for example, or so that experience of being immersed in the role 24/7 is very unique to this type of profession. Sometimes there can be little structure or guidance in prioritizing things unless the leader brings that priority to the work. And of course, the impact of digital communication is increasingly challenging for clergy. And then we live in an era of what some are calling rapid, discontinuous change, meaning things are changing so quickly, socially, culturally, that you can't predict what's going to come next from what has come before. And so it just requires constant adaptation. This was certainly the case through the global pandemic for religious leaders in ways that were very, very trying. So after 15 years of research and a lot of thought, this is our model of flourishing in ministry, these 5 dimensions: daily well-being, resilience, thriving, authenticity, and then the 5th dimension is the social ecosystem that you can see surrounds all of that. We know these dimensions are interrelated. We're just learning more about how they are, so that's sort of one of the leading edges of the research for us. But we know, for example, that daily well-being is the first thing that gets low for clergy, just that sense of feeling physically healthy, emotionally healthy, relationally healthy, having spiritual well-being. That's the first thing that gets low out of all the dimensions. And if it gets too low for too long, it starts to pull down all the other dimensions as well. And we're just starting to learn more about how these are interrelated. So what I'm going to share with you is what do we mean briefly by each one of these, and then what are we learning about the kinds of practices that we know will boost and promote well-being in each of these areas. So with daily well-being, we talk about the quality of daily life, emotional well-being, and physical well-being, the impact of stress. And what we're learning, the practices that tend to boost daily well-being for clergy are largely what historically would be considered Christian contemplative spiritual practices. Seem to be particularly important for clergy. Also, the theological approach to ministry makes a significant difference. So one of the things that we found is that clergy who approach their work with the notion that God is present everywhere in the world, all the time and always at work in the world. And what we're doing in religious leadership is we are participating, joining in with what God is already doing, tend to flourish long term, as opposed to the assumption that nothing's really happening with respect to God's activity in the world until I show up with my bag of tricks, and then now things can happen. That tends to not flourish long term, psychologically or theologically. So the other thing that we talk about a lot are practices around healthy boundaries, both with work week and understanding how to have sustainable pace with work, because we know well-being ebbs and flows, and we know it accumulates both positively and negatively. And this is the thing that in sharing this, and I've had the privilege of sharing this research with thousands of clergy, and just hear this all the time. I'm so busy getting to the next urgent thing, the next urgent thing, the next urgent thing. I don't take the time to pause and check in with myself in a mindfulness kind of way. What's accumulating, both savoring the joy of ministry, it's very joyful in many ways, or also paying attention to the stress and negative stuff that's accumulating. Mentor of mine in graduate school, this is my favorite quote from him, Dr. Archibald Hart, that I find to be true in this domain. Pastors don't get into trouble because they forget that they're pastors. That's not the issue. It's because that we forget that we're persons. And so to give themselves permission to be human and think about the implications of that for stewardship of themselves and their physical bodies, their emotional well-being, etc. Resilience, we talk about psychological hardiness or grit and adaptability and growth. This is also where we talk about burnout. And the thing I really want you to hear about burnout with clergy is we estimate, at least in our samples, somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% of clergy are in moderate to severe burnout at any given time. But the thing we have heard repeatedly is that it sneaks up on religious leaders. They don't see it coming. It blindsides me, is what they would say. Well, the truth is it builds through that mild and moderate phase of burnout outside of the awareness of a leader. And then it hits a threshold of severity and just hits people all of a sudden. It feels like it came out of nowhere, but it's because we haven't been paying attention to what's been building. So what we know actually helps people recover and also prevent burnout are essentially teaching and helping clergy grow in emotional self-regulation kinds of competencies. And psychology certainly has a lot to help us say about that. The thriving dimension is about connectedness to meaning and purpose, to God. Those two pieces tend to be fairly high for clergy compared to the general population. It's the connection to other people piece that tends to not go as well. It's a socially and psychologically isolating role, which is a surprise to people. If you've never been in a clergy role, people think, well, Pastor, all you do is you're around people all the time. How could you possibly feel lonely or isolated? And yet, inherently, the way people relate to the role, the nature of the stress can be very psychologically isolating. It's sort of the water everywhere, not a drop to drink kind of a phenomenon. So there are some key kinds of relationships that we find help clergy flourish. The one I want to mention that really jumps out at us in terms of the analysis is called having a community of practice. So getting together with other people that do what you do, your guild as it were. And clergy tend not to do this nearly as much as other helping professions get together with their own guild. But getting together with people that understand your world, understand what it's like from the inside, you can share hopes and fears and joys and stresses and ideas and support and all those kinds of things really do make an enormous difference over time. And then finally, the authenticity piece, which is trying to reconcile a role that has a lot of external demands. There's a lot of what one author calls presumptive criticism with religious leaders, people in a congregation who presume to know better than you do how to do your job and feel like it's their job to tell you that and tell other people that on Facebook or what have you, and just constantly dealing with all the expectations of other people. So how do I live into this role with all these demands in a way that feels congruent, that feels true self, as it were, that I can feel like I'm living into deeper and deeper authenticity as a person. And what we find is helpful there is what we call job crafting. And so to look at what are my strengths and help people approach this in a strength-based kind of way, and do job crafting of time and energy management and job description, emphasizing those strengths and then helping people build a team around them of lay leaders or other clergy, if the church is large enough to have other staff that have complementary strengths and approach things as a team is just a much more sustainable way to go. To lead out of my strengths at least 60% of the time seems to be the threshold over the course of a long period of time, say a year or more. And let me see what else I wanted to share here. So what we have done with this in the translational research part, I'll just mention this. I'll skip ahead here for the sake of time. We also looked through at the time, and this probably needs to be updated, the research literature on well-being practices. What are the actual practices that help people improve their well-being in one of these facets or another? And we categorize those into 7 strategies that you can see here. And these strategies map onto one or more of those flourishing dimensions. And we developed an app that's free for clergy. It's available globally now at www.flourishinginministry.org. And you can complete this. You get a personalized profile that looks like the left-hand piece there. Are you high, medium, and low in these dimensions? And then based on your results, the algorithm will push practices toward you that will boost your well-being if you practice them with a certain frequency and duration. And the good news there that we know from the research is that small steps done frequently and consistently really do accumulate positively. And so that's often where we start in coaching with clergy is let's just take some small steps. Let's talk about what you're already doing that's sustaining your well-being and identify that, amplify that, do more of that, and then maybe add a couple of small steps to that will build over time, and then we'll keep adding to that, so that we don't set really, really lofty goals that are so aspirational and enormous that we never really do follow through with them. But small steps done frequently and consistently over time. And most of those practices, again, are ancient Christian spiritual practices that promote human flourishing in general, but specifically are vitally important for the well-being of clergy over time.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.